Hey guys, I hope you're all doing well. Welcome to our little video tutorial here on the major writing assignment, also known as the position paper for our Social Studies -1 classes. So as you'll see here, I've provided you with a quick overview of what the document that you will be receiving looks like. This, take note, is a Social Studies 30 version of the paper, and so it will change a little bit if you are in Social Studies 10-1 or 20-1. So a couple things to keep in mind with this position paper is that number one, you're going to be provided with one quote. Typically, it's going to be something relatively short. It won't always have a thinker that is associated with or a person that's associated with it. But it will be a quote or a short little excerpt in a perspective. You will be required to write a formal essay response, which means that you are going to refrain from using first person, terms like you, I, we, us, so on and so forth. The major point of this assignment is to answer the question that is provided to you. So for our Social Studies 30 students, that is the ideological perspective that you're looking at in regards to the source. For our Social 10, you will be looking at the perspective of globalization reflected in the source. And for our Social Studies 20-1, you guys will be replacing that with the perspective on nationalism reflected in the source. Couple things to keep in mind, and we're going to go through all of this in the next couple of slides, is you in your essay must analyze the source, demonstrate an understanding of the perspective reflected in the source. You must also establish and argue a position. This is going to come into play when we get into our thesis statements right away. And you must also support your position and arguments by using evidence. So evidence is going to be interchangeably used with things like examples or case studies throughout the rest of this video. Just last thing to kind of keep in mind here is that the diploma suggestion for this paper is that you are going to be able to write it in 90 to 105 minutes, and you are going to try and stick within the 750 to 1600 word range. All right, one thing I want you to bear in mind as we kind of go through all of these slides is that everything that we're doing is to answer the topic question. To what extent should the perspective of the source be embraced? Now, we're going to kind of go through this in terms of the expectations. So when I'm looking at a rubric, which I'll show you in just a moment here, when we're looking at a rubric, what are you supposed to be doing? And so rather than looking at format and what kind of goes in each paragraph, we're going to take a look at this and say, the first expectation is that you understand the source. And again, this is a look at the perspective of the source. We are going to do this through our interpretation. So some of the things that we might want to start with is, are there any thinkers, are there any people or theories that might agree or align with the perspective of the source? This, for my Social 30 students, you guys could be looking at people like Karl Marx, Adam Smith, Rousseau, Mill, you name it. Can we associate any of them with the perspective that's provided? For Social 10 and Social 20, we might think of famous Canadians or politicians or world leaders that might align with the thinking of the source here. Next thing we kind of need to look at is the actual perspective. So does the source agree or disagree with grade 10's globalization, 20's nationalism, 30's liberalism? Then we should also kind of take a look at is what might someone disagree, or what is another opinion that somebody might have on the source. These are all good things to include in your interpretation to make sure that you are getting to the depth and you are acting insightfully in the writing here. We can do this by looking at the issue or dilemma behind the source. Now, bear in mind, we're not going to give you something that's really easy, anything that's really black and white. Everything that we're going to give you in terms of a quote is going to be controversial in some way, shape, or form. All of these things together are going to help make up the introduction paragraph within our formal essay. Now, the last thing that you need to include in your formal essay here and your introduction paragraph, so again in our intro, is going to be our thesis. Again, the thesis comes down to being a statement of position. Now, grade 10 specifically, I really want you to focus on refraining from using I. So we're not going to look at I believe or I think or the source to me, yada yada, right? We are going to go with a phrasing similar to the example that I provided for you here on the bottom. Now, the thesis statement needs to be accountable for a couple of things. Number one, it does need to focus on what is your position. So if we kind of look up here, we are seeing that the thesis statement has to take a position, whether we agree, we disagree, or we agree to an extent or disagree to an extent. The other thing that we have to include in our thesis statement is our whys, which also factors in the argumentation. So these are not our case studies, that are not our examples. This is the reason that we take a stance. These reasons we will then support later in our body paragraphs with the case studies and the evidence. So again, if you take a look down here at the example thesis statement. So again, this is a pretty simple thesis statement, but also a very effective way of phrasing your thesis statement. The perspective of the source should or should not be embraced because blank, blank, and blank. Those blanks are obviously going to be our arguments. Those are the whys. Now, in social studies, any level, we can look at a set of different arguments that do work for many of the different quotes that you will receive. Remember, the argumentation is the why, the reason that you are going to defend your position, not an example of why you're taking the position. So a couple of the ones that we look at that work again across 10, 20, and 30, morality, ethics, sustainability, prosperity, economics, that could be economic prosperity, economic sustainability, social acceptance, environment, effectiveness, efficiency. These are all whys. To support or oppose an issue, these are not the examples. So these arguments will be in two key places throughout your essay. They will be presented in your thesis statement, and then they are going to be used again in your body paragraphs in order to link the evidence to your case studies. So they do serve a purpose. Let's take a quick look at writing an example thesis statement. So this is the one here I've done for you. We're going to assume that our interpretation, and you will have a handout attached to this video tutorial that looks at a bunch of questions that we can add to our interpretation if we feel that we're not quite able to do our interpretation. So we're going to assume that the interpretation has been done on this source already, and we're going to kind of step by step go through these three things that are going to create our thesis statement. So if we look at our source, whatever it is that leads human beings to hate, to destroy, and to kill has taken on a collective force like never before. As technology and globalization now give it the capacity to not just strike, but to strike us all together as one. Obviously, one of the first things that we're going to have to do is what is the perspective of the source. So for me, when I look at this source, I'm saying that the source believes globalization has become too powerful. So really when it comes down to it, it's actually presenting a negative or an anti-globalization perspective. Next thing that I want to do is take a look at whether I agree or disagree with that perspective. It is an anti-globalization perspective. I can't say that I completely disregard globalization as something that's being negative. So I'm going to put I agree to an extent, which means I'm going to have a couple arguments that are going to support why I agree that globalization is pretty negative, as well as a reason why, an argument that states why I think globalization is actually pretty positive. So when I look at those three arguments, I'm going to use, if we head back to our previous slide here, I can choose from any of the ones that we had previously discussed. I'm going to choose morals. Okay, globalization has become an all-power phenomenon, which can be positive because of the efficiency of technology. So that's kind of one of the reasons that I agree. But needs to be kept managed due to that same technology potentially causing moral issues. If we think about some of the people that kind of control the technology and control media even, how they have a great responsibility on their shoulders, right? To quote, I think it's Spider-Man, right? With great power comes great responsibility. And so we can look at that source in the same type of perspective. And you guys all know me, you know my stance on the environment, you know I have a little crush on Elon Musk. So that environmental cost, right? Those of you guys that remember Social 10 and looking at the banana wars when we studied how many corporations are moving to produce Cavendish bananas because of their ability to travel distances and not get overripe too fast. All that perfect condition of shipping bananas worldwide leads to a lack of biodiversity within regions of the world, which does have an environmental cost. And so we come up with a thesis statement that looks something a little bit like what I have over here, written in blue. So it doesn't need to be as fancy as that. It can kind of fit within our other format as well. So on the next slide here, I'm going to give you an opportunity to go through the same thing as well. Feel free to pause the video here if you want to go through this. Otherwise, if you're happy with the explanation and the one that we just did together, you can hold off right there. So again, those three things that you will want to accomplish right away are: what is the perspective of the source? Do you agree or disagree with that perspective? And then let's come up with a list of whys in terms of your agreeing or disagreeing. And feel free to plunk those statements or plunk all of that back into the example thesis statement or the structure of the thesis statement I gave you a few slides back. So that's going to kind of conclude your introduction paragraph. You're going to use that thesis statement as the start of the rest of your paper, the body of your paper. So the next expectation that we really have of you is to develop your argumentation. Argumentation, as it was already part of the thesis, is also going to become part of the body of the essay. And we are going to have 3 body paragraphs in total, looking at 3 potential case studies and 3 potential arguments. Now, as you can see with the rubric that I provided you, argumentation is its own category within the rubric. And the biggest thing about argumentation that we have to realize is that we need to establish a relationship between the position, the arguments, and the perspective of globalization, nationalism, or the ideological perspective of the source. So again, it has to be the link between the evidence and the case studies, and it has to be developed. So if you take a look over here at the example that I've given you. Now, this is an example of a student from a grade 10 paper that has taken a look at the development of their argument before really getting into their case study. Now, I've highlighted very specific argumentation within this paragraph, but throughout the entire paragraph, they consistently are relating back to their argumentation to give some purpose to the evidence that they are later going to provide. I also just want to draw your attention over here to this little number 8 next to argumentation. This paper is out of 30 total, and 8 marks are allocated to the argumentation. The expectation that we look at next was that category right next to argumentation on the rubric, and that is a look at evidence. Evidence, again, is going to be part of the body of the essay, so we're looking at those 3 body paragraphs, and evidence for us is going to have to be factual, relevant, and connected to the argument to prove the position. So in terms of factual, we are looking for, can you provide examples? Can you provide evidence that comes from class notes, that comes from projects that you've developed, or even research that you've had to do not only in the class, but in other social studies classes as well? So can you provide something that is true? We typically rely on things like quotes, things like statistics, in order to help the strength of that evidence. When we're looking at something being relevant, something I want you to keep in mind is that if you're in grade 10, sure, you've got a bunch of things in grade 10 that can work for this paper. When you get to grade 11, you now have all of your grade 10 material plus your grade 11 material. I'd like you to try and use the appropriate material for the appropriate grade level. So this isn't saying that you cannot use the Rwandan genocide if you are in grade 12 and writing a paper, but let's try and use something from grade 12 curriculum, something from grade 12 projects to write those grade 12 papers. Same thing for grade 11, same thing for grade 10. The other thing that is really important when it comes to relevance of information, we don't just want verbal diarrhea of everything you know. You do need to be specific in the evidence you're providing, in the case studies you're providing, to make sure that they, link to your argument, that they are actually pulled out of the overall case study to be specific in proving whatever argument you were trying. So, for example, we get lots of papers on Hitler and his use of a dictatorship and kind of what he ended up doing during the Second World War and during the Holocaust. Well, I don't need to know absolutely everything about Hitler and the Holocaust for you to prove something about dictatorships are immoral, right? Pick and choose the information from your understanding of Hitler and Hitler's rise to power that support that specific argument. The last thing that we obviously need to look at here is that connectedness to the argument to prove your position. So again, stay away from statements without giving them a why or a how in terms of helping your position. So if you've written a paper for many of your social studies teachers before and you get the why written on there, you get a how, you get a so what in terms of your feedback. This now has to be on you. When you're in your proofreading of your essay, make sure you're asking yourself those questions. Read your statement, read your evidence and say, why am I using this in the body of my paragraph? What's my purpose in doing so? If you have these statements throughout and you don't have to ask yourself, so what? Then you're probably on the right track of linking your evidence to your arguments. Last but not least, our final expectation, again, coming down into the rubric here, is going to be our communication. We're basically looking for three things when it comes to communication. We're looking for spelling, grammar mechanics, as well as the use of appropriate vocabulary, especially social studies relevant vocabulary. And last but not least, organization. So again, I didn't really give you a format aside from saying there should be about a 5-paragraph essay. Our first one's going to be our intro, interpretation, thesis statement. Our second, third, and fourth going to be the body. And our last one's going to be the conclusion. It doesn't have to be written that way, but it does have to be written in an organized fashion. So most students tend to write in this kind of way. If you're not quite sure what to write in your conclusion, remember we want to summarize. We want to restate in a forceful manner your position, your best argument, and your case study. So in other words, restate your thesis. Now, I want to encourage you here right now that when you come back and you are going to end up proofreading your essay. So when we look at our proofreading, our thesis and our summarization that happens in our conclusion paragraph should mimic what we are setting the stage to do in our intro paragraph. So our conclusion in some way, shape, or form has to mimic the intro. And if they don't, go back to your intro. Don't change your conclusion and then have to change your whole paper. Go back to your intro and make sure that you set yourself up for what you're about to do in the rest of the paper. Last thing that I want to note on this page over here is if you take a look at the bottom, we've got the total out of 30. So this is a major writing assignment. It is worth 30 marks. It's worth a little bit more than your 3-source analysis. And we expect you to go into that detail and that depth of your understanding in the position paper. Last but not least, you are going to have a few links attached to this video for further explanations. So we will be providing you with a writing guide, which goes into detail some of the information that you've seen here. We will be giving you practice essays while you are, at home doing this learning on your own, thanks to the COVID-19 that's circulating right now. And we are going to provide you with a link to Alberta Education that has a whole host of diploma exemplars. Now, Social 10 and Social 20, you'll have to replace liberalism for globalization and nationalism, respectively, but it will give you the idea of what a satisfactory paper looks like. Which are those papers in that 60% ballpark, those PF papers look like, which are going to be those papers in that 80% ballpark, and those E papers, which are going to be kind of that 90+% paper. It'll give you an idea of what those look like, at least at the 30 level. If you do have any other questions, guys, remember you can connect with your teacher, ask a teacher. Maybe you have a sibling that's been through social studies 30 before. Ask them as well. They probably remember something, hopefully, fingers crossed. Otherwise, enjoy. I hope you're all doing okay.